I took the position at Langfield Memorial because it was the only hospital that would have me after what happened in Morgantown. That's not the story I'm here to tell, but it matters that you understand. I wasn't in a position to be picky. Langfield was a 240-bed facility in a town that barely needed half that capacity. The kind of place where the parking lot was always mostly empty, where the hallways echoed, where the cafeteria closed at 6 because there was no night demand. I was hired as a psychiatric intake coordinator. Fancy title for a simple job. Process new admissions, confirm insurance, complete preliminary assessments, assign beds. Paperwork. Routine. The kind of work that lets your mind go still. I started in March. The building was older than it looked from the outside. Built in the early 70s, renovated superficially in 2004, which mostly meant new paint over old problems. The psychiatric wing was on the 3rd floor, separated from the general medical floors by a locked corridor that required a badge and a 4-digit code. 12 rooms on each side, a nursing station in the center, a day room at the far end with windows that faced the tree line. It smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet, that particular institutional smell that never fully goes away no matter how many times they mop. My office was just inside the locked corridor, first door on the left. A desk, a computer that took 4 minutes to boot, a filing cabinet from a different era, and a window that looked out at the HVAC system on the adjacent roof. Not glamorous. I didn't need glamorous. I needed quiet, regular hours and a paycheck that would let me rebuild after Morgantown. The first 3 months were unremarkable. I processed admissions, voluntary and involuntary, filled out the same forms, asked the same questions, entered the same data into the same outdated system. Most patients came in for 72-hour holds. Suicidal ideation, psychotic episodes, severe anxiety with self-harm risk. The usual spectrum of human suffering distilled into checkboxes and drop-down menus. I'd complete the intake, hand the file to whichever nurse was on, and move to the next one. Sometimes I'd do 2 in a day. Sometimes none for a week. I got to know the staff the way you get to know coworkers you don't have much in common with. Dr. Harwick ran the unit, a quiet man in his 50s who always wore the same 3 ties in rotation. Nurse Pratchett handled day shifts and had been there since before the renovation. Torres and Kim alternated nights. There was a social worker named Deborah who always seemed to be on the phone, and a custodian named Gerald who moved through the hallways like a man trying not to disturb the air. It was Gerald who first said something. This would have been June, maybe early July. He was emptying the trash in my office. He always came by around 4, and he paused at the door on his way out. I remember because Gerald never paused. He moved with a kind of mechanical efficiency, room to room, floor to floor, always on schedule. "You keep track of the dates?" he asked. I looked up from my screen. "What dates?" "When they come in. The patients." "That's literally my job, Gerald." He nodded, but he didn't leave. He stood there with the trash bag in his hand, looking at the filing cabinet like it owed him something. Then he said, "You ever notice anything about the 14ths? I told him I hadn't. He nodded again, said, "Okay," and left. I didn't think about it for another 3 weeks. The thing about intake coordination is that you do see dates. Constantly. Admission date, projected discharge date, insurance renewal date, court hearing date, if applicable. Dates become background noise. They stop meaning anything beyond their function as organizational markers. The 14th of any given month was just another number in a long sequence of numbers. But after Gerald mentioned it, I started noticing. Not intentionally. More the way you notice a word after someone points it out to you, the way it suddenly appears everywhere. In July, a woman named Sandra Koff was admitted on the 14th. Voluntary. Severe insomnia and related paranoia. Standard intake, nothing unusual. In August, a man named Robert Delaney came in on the 14th. Involuntary. Brought in by his wife after 3 days of what she described as not sleeping and not making sense. Again, standard. I wouldn't have connected them at all if it weren't for the intake forms. Part of the preliminary assessment involves a section where I record the patient's stated reason for seeking help, or in the case of involuntary holds, a brief description of the presenting behavior. I write what they say. Their words, not mine. Sandra Koff, when I asked her what brought her in, had said, "I can't sleep," because of the sentence. I'd written it down exactly as she said it. I remember asking her to elaborate, and she'd just shaken her head and said she'd rather talk to the doctor about it. Normal enough. People often don't want to explain themselves twice. I completed the rest of the form and sent her through. Robert Delaney hadn't been coherent enough for a standard intake interview, so his form was mostly filled in from his wife's account. But in the margin of the form, and I have a habit of jotting things in the margin that don't fit neatly into any box, I'd written, "Patient repeatedly asking, 'Did you hear what it said?'" These are the kind of details that disappear into the volume of paperwork. I never would have looked at them side by side if Gerald hadn't planted that seed. But once I pulled both files, it was there. 2 patients, both admitted on the 14th, both referencing something heard, something spoken. I told myself it was coincidence. 2 data points is not a pattern. It's barely an anecdote. I put the files back, finished my day, drove home to my apartment on Collier Street, heated up leftover pasta, and watched the news until I fell asleep on the couch. September 14th was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were usually slow. Most admits happen later in the week, Thursdays and Fridays especially, when families reached their limits and the crisis calls piled up. But that Tuesday, we got a new patient. A young man, 23, named Marcus Bell. Voluntary admission, anxiety and what he called intrusive auditory experiences. I did his intake myself. He was calm, polite, clearly educated. Later I found out he was a graduate student in mathematics at the university 40 minutes away. He sat across from me in the intake room, a small space with 2 chairs and a table bolted to the floor, and he answered my questions with the kind of precision that told me he'd been thinking about this for a while. "Can you describe the auditory experiences?" I asked. "It's 1 sentence," he said. "I keep hearing the same sentence. I felt something then, not quite recognition, not quite alarm. More like the feeling you get when you think you've left the stove on but you're already in the car. A low, nagging awareness that something needs your attention. Can you tell me what the sentence is?" He looked at me for a long moment, not with suspicion or reluctance. More like he was trying to decide if the words would sound as strange said aloud as they did inside his head. "You're not going to write it down," he said. "I need to note your symptoms for the file." "No," he said. "I mean, I'll tell you, but I don't think you should write it down." I told him I understood his concern, but that everything in the intake was confidential and only accessible to his treatment team. Standard reassurance. He nodded slowly. "It says, 'The body remembers the room.'" I wrote it down. 5 words. I wrote them in the symptoms section of his intake form, added the appropriate clinical language around it. Patient reports recurrent intrusive auditory hallucination consisting of a single repeated phrase, and moved on to the next section. After Marcus Bell was processed and taken to his room, I sat at my desk for a while. I wasn't thinking anything in particular. Or rather, I was trying not to. I pulled Sandra Koff's file again. She'd been discharged in late July after 10 days. Her discharge summary, written by Dr. Harwick, noted that her insomnia had resolved and that she no longer reported auditory disturbances. There was no record of what specific sentence she'd reported hearing. Her intake form had only my note, "I can't sleep because of the sentence." Robert Delaney's file was thinner. He'd been transferred to a larger facility in Benton after 48 hours because Langfield didn't have the resources for his level of care. His transfer summary mentioned disorganized thinking and auditory hallucinations, but didn't specify content. 3 patients, 3/14, all reporting something heard. A sentence. I want to be clear about something. I am not a clinician. I am not qualified to diagnose anyone, and I'm not qualified to interpret psychiatric symptoms. My job was administrative, but I've worked in behavioral health settings long enough to know what's common and what isn't, and what I was seeing didn't match any pattern I recognized. Auditory hallucinations are common enough, but a specific identical phrase reported by unrelated patients admitted on the same calendar date. That's not in any textbook I've ever encountered. I thought about mentioning it to Dr. Harwick. I drafted an email, actually. Something casual, framed as a curiosity. "Hey, noticed something interesting in the intake records. Wondered if you'd seen any clinical correlation." I deleted it before sending. It felt absurd. It felt like I was seeing a pattern that wasn't there. The way people see faces in clouds or meaning in coincidence. Apophenia, I think it's called. I'd learned the word in a psychology elective years ago. October 14th fell on a Thursday. I came in that morning with a feeling I couldn't quite name. Not dread, exactly. More like anticipation. The kind of alertness you feel before a storm, when the air changes pressure and your body knows something is coming before your mind does. No admission came through on the 14th. I checked the logs at 8, at noon, at 4. Nothing. I felt foolish. I felt relieved. I went home and slept well for the first time in days. On the 15th, I came in and found a file on my desk that I hadn't processed. A patient had been admitted at 11:47 p.m. on the 14th, after I'd left for the day. Kim, the night nurse, had done the intake herself, which was unusual but not against protocol. The patient was a woman in her 60s named Dorothy Marsh. Involuntary hold. Brought in by police after being found standing in the road on Route 9, unresponsive to traffic. Kim's intake notes were brief and clinical. Under presenting symptoms, she'd written, patient non-communicative, appears alert but will not respond to questions. Only verbalization recorded. Patient repeated a single phrase 3 times before becoming silent again. The phrase was not recorded. I found Kim in the break room that afternoon. She was eating a granola bar and looking at her phone, and she seemed tired in the way night nurses always seem tired, not just physically, but existentially, as though the world had worn down some necessary buffer. "The Marsh intake," I said. "You didn't write down what she said." Kim looked up. "What?" "Dorothy Marsh. You noted she repeated a phrase. You didn't record the phrase." She put her phone down. "I didn't think it was relevant to the assessment." "It's part of the symptom presentation," she said it really quietly. "I wasn't sure I heard it right." "What did it sound like?" Kim picked at her granola bar. She seemed uncomfortable, but not in the way people are uncomfortable when they're caught cutting corners. More like she was uncomfortable with the memory itself. "Something about a room," she said. "Something remembering a room." "I don't know. She was barely audible." I thanked her and went back to my office. I sat there for a long time. The HVAC system hummed outside my window. The fluorescent light above my desk buzzed at a frequency just below conscious awareness. I opened a new document on my computer and typed 14th admissions, auditory content. Then I stared at the cursor blinking. I went back further. I'd only been at Langfield since March, but the filing system went back years. The electronic records were spotty before 2018, but the paper files in the basement archive went all the way to the building's opening in 1973. I told myself I was just being thorough. I told myself it was curiosity, the harmless kind, the kind that fills slow afternoons. The archive was in the sub-basement, accessible by a service elevator that required a key Gerald had given me months earlier when I'd needed to retrieve a misfiled insurance document. The sub-basement was exactly what you'd expect. Concrete floors, exposed pipes, rows of metal shelving under fluorescent tubes that flickered in a way the maintenance budget apparently couldn't address. It smelled like dust and something faintly organic, like old paper returning to pulp. The files were organized by year and month. I pulled admission records for the past 5 years. All patients admitted on the 14th of any month. This took most of an afternoon. The records were inconsistent in their detail. Some intake forms were thorough, others were barely filled in. The older the record, the less information was typically included in the symptom presentation section. But I found things. November 14th, 2019. A patient named George Whitfield. His intake noted. Patient reports hearing a voice that repeats itself. Patient unable or unwilling to reproduce what the voice says. February 14th, 2020. A woman named Claire Song. Her intake was done by a coordinator who'd worked the position before me. Someone named F. DeLuca, based on the initials. In the margin, DeLuca had written, BT keeps saying the body remembers, unclear if directed at staff or self. June 14th, 2021. Thomas Park. Intake notes mention perseverative speech pattern, single phrase repeated. No phrase recorded. January 14th, 2022. Maria Sutton. Admitted after a suicide attempt. In her initial assessment, she'd told the intake coordinator, I needed to stop saying it. I compiled these notes in my document. There were gaps, months, where no one was admitted on the 14th, or where the intake notes were too sparse to identify any relevant detail. But the instances I did find were consistent enough to make the back of my neck feel cold. Not every patient admitted on the 14th showed this pattern. I want to be careful about that. Some 14th admissions were completely unremarkable. Drug overdoses, standard holds, patients with well-documented histories of schizophrenia whose symptoms were already understood. But within the subset of patients who were new to the system, who were coming in for the first time with auditory complaints, the consistency was there. A sentence. A single sentence. Something about the body. Something about a room. I did not bring this to Dr. Harwick. I did not bring it to anyone. I told myself it was because I didn't have enough data, because the pattern was too fragile, because I'd look like a conspiracy theorist, because I'd already damaged my career once and couldn't afford to be seen as unstable. All of these reasons were true. But there was another reason underneath them that I didn't want to look at directly. I was afraid that if I told someone, they would explain it. They would tell me it was a known phenomenon, or that it was nothing, or that I was wrong. And then I would have to stop looking, and I didn't want to stop looking. That's the thing about patterns. Once you see them, they become a kind of companion, a private knowledge, something that belongs only to you. November 14th came on a Sunday. I wasn't scheduled to work Sundays, but I found a reason to come in. A filing discrepancy, I told the weekend charge nurse. She didn't care. She barely looked up. I sat in my office with the door open, waiting. At 2:15 in the afternoon, an ambulance brought someone in. I heard it from my office. The distant beeping of the rig backing up to the ER bay, the squawk of the radio. 30 minutes later, my phone rang. New admit for psych. Voluntary. A man named Daniel Correa, 41, referred up from the ER after presenting with acute anxiety and what the ER doc described as possible auditory hallucination. I went down to the intake room. Daniel Correa was a heavy-set man with paint stains on his hands and a look on his face like he hadn't slept in a week. He smelled like turpentine and coffee. He told me he was a house painter, that he'd been working a job on Elm Street for the past 4 days, that he'd started hearing something on Thursday and it hadn't stopped. "What are you hearing?" I asked. "A sentence," he said. His voice was flat with exhaustion. The same sentence, over and over. It's not loud, it's like, "Do you know what it's like when you get a song stuck in your head? It's like that, except I didn't hear it first from somewhere. It just started." "What's the sentence?" He rubbed his face with both hands. The paint stains were white and gray, like tiny clouds across his knuckles. "The body remembers the room," he said. I wrote it down. My hand was steady. I finished the intake. I assigned him a bed. I walked back to my office, sat down, and closed the door. 5 words. The same 5 words. Spanning at least 5 years that I could document, probably longer. Unrelated patients with no connection to each other. Different ages, genders, backgrounds, referral sources. No common physician, no common medication, no shared history. The only thing connecting them was the date of their admission and the content of what they reported hearing. I started staying late. Not dramatically late. An extra hour, maybe 2. I'd sit in my office after the day shift left, listening to the ward settle into its evening rhythm. The psychiatric unit at night was a particular kind of quiet. Not silent. There was always the hum of the HVAC, the occasional footstep of the night nurse making rounds, the distant sound of a television from the day room if anyone was still awake. But it was a contained quiet, sealed. The locked corridor created a pocket of air that felt separated from the rest of the building, from the rest of the world. I started going through older records more systematically. I bring files up from the archive in batches, sorting through them in my office after hours. I was looking for the earliest instance I could find, the first recorded 14th admission with auditory content matching the pattern. The paper records from the 1970s and 80s were sparse. Psychiatric documentation standards were different then. Many of the intake forms were handwritten, faded, sometimes barely legible. But I found one entry from September 14th, 1978. A patient named Harold Webb admitted for acute nervous condition. His intake form was a single page, mostly blank. But in the notes section, someone had written in tight cursive, "Patient insists he keeps hearing a phrase, will not say what it is, becomes agitated when pressed. 6 years after the building opened." I couldn't find anything earlier. That didn't mean it didn't exist. It might have been in files that were lost, destroyed, or never kept. But 1978 was my earliest data point. I started thinking about the building itself. Langfield Memorial had been built on land that had previously been, depending on which source you consulted, either farmland or the site of a smaller medical facility that had burned in the 1960s. The County Historical Society had a few photographs of the original structure, but I couldn't find much detail about what it had been used for. A small general practice, maybe. Or a convalescent home. The records were vague. I looked into it the way you look into things when you have time and a public library card and an internet connection that works at 2 a.m. I found property records, a brief mention in a local history published in 1989, a grainy photograph in the county newspaper's archive that showed a long, low building with a distinctive peaked roof. Nothing about what happened there. Nothing about why it burned. I want to be honest about my state of mind during this period. I was not sleeping well. I was eating irregularly. I was spending most of my non-working hours either researching or thinking about researching. I recognized in the clinical part of my brain that I was exhibiting behavior patterns associated with obsessive fixation. I recognized that my recent professional history, the incident in Morgantown, the relocation, the isolation of a new town, made me vulnerable to exactly this kind of cognitive narrowing. I recognized all of this, and I continued anyway. December 14th, a Wednesday. I was ready this time. I was at my desk by 7, 2 hours before my shift technically started. I had a fresh intake form prepared. I had my questions mapped out. I felt like a scientist waiting for a controlled experiment to produce results. No one was admitted on December 14th. I checked and rechecked. I called the ER to ask if there were any behavioral health referrals pending. There weren't. I checked the next day and the day after that. Nothing. The pattern had broken. Or I had misidentified the pattern. Or the pattern was more complex than I'd assumed. Not every 14th, but only certain 14ths determined by criteria I hadn't identified yet. I felt irrationally upset. Then I felt embarrassed for feeling upset. Then I went home and poured myself a drink and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the sounds of the building, the water in the pipes, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the floors above me settling in the cold. January came. The 14th was a Saturday. I came in. Nothing. February 14th, a Tuesday, Valentine's Day. Nothing. I started to believe I'd made the whole thing up. Not fabricated it exactly, but inflated it. Seen a pattern in random noise. Confirmation bias. Apophenia. The same cognitive traps that fill conspiracy forums and make people see messages in static. By March, I'd mostly stopped thinking about it. I'd deleted the document on my computer. I hadn't gone down to the archive in weeks. I was sleeping better. I was eating regular meals. I'd even started talking to a woman named Sarah who worked in hospital administration, a floor below me. Nothing serious. Just coffee in the cafeteria, comfortable conversation about nothing in particular. March 14th was a Tuesday. At 9:22 a.m., I got the call from the ER. New admit. A teenage boy, 16, brought in by his mother after 3 nights without sleep. The mother was hysterical. The boy was calm. Too calm, the ER doc said. I went down to do the intake. The boy's name was Ethan Marsh. Marsh. I pulled up the records later to confirm, but I already knew. Dorothy Marsh, the woman brought in by police after standing in the road on Route 9. October 14th. This was her grandson. Ethan sat across from me in the intake room, and he looked at me with eyes that were flat and exhausted and somehow older than 16. His mother had been asked to wait outside. It was just us and the table bolted to the floor and the fluorescent light that buzzed overhead. Ethan, I said, can you tell me what's been happening? My grandmother was here, he said. Last year. I can't confirm or deny other patients. I know she was here. She told me about it after she got out, about what she kept hearing. I set my pen down. What did she tell you? She said it was a sentence. She said it started when she was in the building, but it didn't stop when she left. She said she still hears it, every day. Quieter than before, but still there. Ethan, are you hearing something? He was quiet for a moment. His hands were flat on the table, perfectly still. He wasn't fidgeting, wasn't tapping, wasn't showing any of the restless energy you typically see in adolescence in crisis. I went to visit her last week, he said. At her house. I was in her guest room, the room she stayed in when she first got out of here. And I heard it. The sentence? Yeah. Can you tell me what it says? The body remembers the room. I didn't write it down immediately. I sat there for a moment, looking at this boy, and I thought about the fact that his grandmother had been admitted on October 14th, and now he was being admitted on March 14th, and they were both reporting the same 5 words. "Ethan," I said, "did your grandmother tell you what the sentence was? Before you heard it yourself?" He shook his head. "She wouldn't say it out loud. She said she didn't want to put it in anyone else's head. I only heard it when I was in the room." "Which room?" "Her guest room, the one on the 2nd floor. I finished the intake. I assigned Ethan to room 7, one of the quieter rooms at the end of the hall. I went back to my office. I sat at my desk and I opened a new document and I stared at the white screen. Something had shifted. The pattern I'd identified wasn't just about the date of admission. It wasn't a coincidence of calendar and symptom. There was a transmission element. Dorothy Marsh had heard the sentence in the hospital. She'd taken it home with her. And now her grandson had heard it in her home, in a specific room. The body remembers the room. I started going back through the discharge records of every 14th patient I'd identified. Where did they go after they left? What happened to them? Most of the records only tracked patients through their hospital stay. After discharge, they fell off our radar unless they were readmitted. But a few had follow-up notes, post-discharge phone calls, outpatient referral confirmations. George Whitfield, November 2019. Discharged to home. Follow-up call logged 3 weeks later. Patient reports improvement. Still occasionally hears phrase, but states it no longer causes distress. Claire Song, February 2020. Discharged to home. No follow-up on record. Marcus Bell, the graduate student, September of the previous year. I looked him up. He'd been discharged after 7 days. His discharge summary noted resolution of symptoms, but there was a follow-up note from Dr. Harwick dated 3 weeks after discharge. Patient called requesting readmission. State symptoms returned after returning home. Advised outpatient follow-up. Patient declined. Marcus Dell had not been readmitted to Langfield. But I searched the broader record system, the one that connected to other facilities in the region, and found that he'd been admitted to Benton Regional on November 14th. November 14th. I sat back. Marcus Bell was admitted to Langfield on September 14th, discharged, and then readmitted to a different facility on November 14th, 2 months later. The same date. I didn't know what to do with this information. I didn't know if it meant anything. Dates can be coincidences. People can relapse on any day. There was nothing clinically meaningful about the 14th of the month. It wasn't a full moon cycle, wasn't aligned with any medication schedule, wasn't significant in any system I could identify. But I kept looking. Daniel Correa. The house painter November. I found his discharge records. He'd been released after 5 days. Symptoms resolved. No follow-up on record. I searched for subsequent admissions at any facility in the database. Nothing. But I found something else. A note in the maintenance log. Gerald's domain, dated 3 days after Correa's discharge. It read, Room 4, unusual staining on wall behind bed, cleaned, source unclear. Room 4 was where Correa had stayed. I found Gerald the next afternoon. He was in the supply closet on the 2nd floor, reorganizing cleaning products with the quiet intensity of a man who takes his work seriously. "Gerald," I said, "can I ask you something?" He didn't look up from the bottle of disinfectant he was labeling. "Sure. Last November, you logged a stain in room 4. Do you remember what it looked like?" He paused, looked at the bottle in his hand, then at me. "Why?" "I'm reviewing maintenance records as part of a facility assessment." A lie. A bad one. Gerald didn't seem to care. "It was dark," he said. "Brownish. Behind the headboard. It looked like it had come through the wall from the other side, but there's nothing on the other side of that wall except the corridor. What did you clean it with? Bleach solution first, then painted over it. Came back. The stain came back? Twice. Then it stopped. He went back to labeling his bottles. I stood in the doorway waiting for him to say something else, but he didn't. I was about to leave when he spoke again without looking up. You looked into the 14s. Yeah, I said. I did. DeLuca did too, Gerald said. Before you. F. DeLuca? The person who had my job before me? Yeah. What happened to them? Gerald placed the last bottle on the shelf, perfectly aligned with the others. He closed the supply closet door and turned to face me. They stopped coming to work, he said. February last year, didn't quit, didn't get fired, just stopped. HR sent letters, never heard back. Do you know where they went? No. Did they tell you what they found? About the pattern? Gerald looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not concern, not warning, not fear. Something closer to resignation. The face of someone watching a process they've seen before reach a stage they recognize. They told me the sentence, he said. I waited. I told them I didn't want to hear it. They told me anyway. Said it would help me understand. Do you hear it? I asked. The sentence? Gerald picked up his supply caddy. I hear lots of things in this building, he said. Pipes. Vents. Settling. You work in a place long enough, you stop noticing what you hear. He walked past me into the hallway and I watched him disappear around the corner, his footsteps steady and even, his pace exactly what it always was. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my apartment on Collier Street, and I listened to the building around me, and I thought about Gerald's face when he said he'd been told the sentence. He hadn't said he didn't hear it. He hadn't said he did. He'd said he'd stopped noticing. I thought about what that would feel like. A sentence in your mind, constant, so constant that it becomes the same as silence. Background. Infrastructure. Like the hum of the HVAC, like the buzz of the fluorescents. Something you live inside without acknowledging. The body remembers the room. I noticed, lying there in the dark, that I was thinking the sentence. Not hearing it. Thinking it. There's a difference. I was repeating it to myself the way you repeat something you've read too many times, the way a word becomes strange when you say it over and over. Semantic satiation. A known phenomenon. Totally normal. I decided to take a step back. I didn't go down to the archive for the rest of March. I stopped pulling old files. I focused on my work, my routine, my meals, my conversations with Sarah in the cafeteria. I was deliberate about it. I was managing my cognitive state. I was being responsible. April 14th was a Friday. I was not watching for it. I was actively not watching for it. But at 3:30 in the afternoon, my phone rang. New admit from the ER. I could have let Kim handle it. She was coming on at 4 for the night shift. But I didn't. I took the call. I went down. The patient was a woman in her 30s. Her name was Jeanette Olivos. She was a librarian at the public branch on Madison. She was very calm, very articulate, very clearly frightened underneath her composure. I've been hearing a sentence, she said, before I even asked. I set my pen down. Tell me. I know how this sounds. I'm not schizophrenic. I don't have a history of anything. I've never been in a hospital for this kind of thing. But I've been hearing the same sentence for 3 weeks, and I need it to stop. What's the sentence? The body remembers the room. I nodded. I picked up my pen. I wrote it down. My hand was not steady this time. Jeanette, I said, can I ask you something that's not on the standard form? She looked at me warily but nodded. Where were you when you first heard it? At work, she said. In the archive room. The basement level. Were you alone? Yes. Had you recently visited anyone? Someone who'd been ill or in a hospital. She frowned. No, why would you? She paused. Actually, my neighbor, Mrs. Song. She was in the hospital a few years ago. Why are you asking me this? Klasong. February 14th, 2020. Jeanette Olivos lived next to a former patient. It's just part of the assessment, I said. I finished the intake. I assigned her a room. I went back to my office and I closed the door and I put my head on my desk. It was spreading. Not through the hospital specifically, through proximity. Patients heard the sentence, took it with them when they left, and then the people around them started hearing it too. Not immediately, not predictably, but eventually. And when those new hearers reached a crisis point, they ended up at a hospital, and statistically, some percentage of them happened to arrive on the 14th. Or the 14th was when they arrived because the 14th was when the sentence reached a certain intensity. Because the 14th was meaningful for a reason I didn't understand. Because the 14th was part of the mechanism. I don't know. I still don't know. I started tracking it differently after that. Not just admissions, but connections. I built a diagram, handwritten, on a legal pad I kept in my apartment, not at work. Lines connecting patients to addresses, addresses to other patients, timestamps showing the progression from hearing to hearing to hearing. What emerged looked like a contact tree, like an epidemiological map. Patient 0, if there was one, was somewhere before my records began, before 1978. Maybe at the original building that burned. The sentence had been moving through people for decades, slowly, person to person, room to room. But that framing didn't quite fit either, because it wasn't just person to person. It was room to room. It was architectural. Dorothy Marsh heard it in the hospital, and then her grandson heard it in her guest room. Jeanette Olivos heard it in her library's basement, and she lived next to a former patient. The sentence seemed to embed itself in spaces, in rooms. The body remembers the room. I was thinking the sentence constantly now. Not hearing it. I need to be clear about that. I was not experiencing auditory hallucinations. I was thinking the words because I'd been immersed in them for months, because they become central to my intellectual fixation, because that is what human brains do with information that occupies them intensively. This was rumination, not psychosis. I knew the difference. I'm trained to know the difference. But I started to wonder if that distinction mattered as much as I thought it did. In May, I went to see De Luca's apartment. I found the address through the HR file. I shouldn't have accessed it, but the system at Langfield was old enough and poorly secured enough that my credentials worked in departments they technically shouldn't have. De Luca had lived on Westmore, a few blocks from the hospital. A small apartment building, 4 units, nothing remarkable. I went there on a Saturday afternoon. I didn't know what I expected to find. The building was still occupied. I could see curtains in the windows, a bicycle locked to the porch railing. De Luca's unit was 2B, second floor left. The curtains were drawn. I stood on the sidewalk looking up at the window, and I felt absurd, and I felt certain, and I felt something else I can only describe as proximity. The sense of standing very close to something without knowing what it was. I didn't go inside. I didn't knock. I stood there for 5 or 6 minutes, and then I walked home. That night, lying in bed, I had a thought that disturbed me more than anything else had in this entire process. I thought, what if I'm supposed to be documenting this? What if the reason I was hired for this position at this hospital after Morgantown left me with no options? What if the reason was this? What if whoever or whatever is responsible for this sentence placed me here specifically because I'm the kind of person who notices patterns, who can't leave them alone, who will follow them regardless of cost? It's a paranoid thought. I know that. It's the kind of thought that patients report when they're in crisis. The sense that events are arranged, that they have been selected, that their investigation is itself part of the phenomenon they're investigating. I know this. I've processed intake forms where patients describe exactly this cognitive state. I know it, and I can't make it stop being true feeling. June. I was barely sleeping. Sarah had stopped trying to talk to me in the cafeteria. I don't blame her. I must have seemed distracted, closed off elsewhere. The weather was getting warmer, and the ward was busy with the usual summer uptick in crisis presentations, and I was doing my job adequately but mechanically, going through the motions while my actual attention was somewhere else entirely. June 14th was a Wednesday. I was at my desk. I was ready. At 10:00 a.m., my computer chimed. An admission had been entered into the system, but not by me. The patient had been admitted directly through the ER without a psych intake referral, a medical admission to the 4th floor. General medicine, not psychiatric. The patient's name was Frank DeLuca. I read it 3 times. Then I stood up from my desk so fast my chair rolled back and hit the wall. I walked to the elevator. I pressed the button for 4. I stood in the hallway of the general medical floor, and I looked at the whiteboard behind the nurse's station that listed room assignments, and there it was. DeLuca, F, room 412. I walked toward the room. I don't know what I was planning to do. Introduce myself? Ask questions? I just needed to see them. This person who'd held my job, who'd noticed the same pattern, who'd disappeared. The door to 412 was open. I stopped in the doorway. Frank DeLuca was a man in his early 50s, thin, with gray hair that looked like it hadn't been cut in a long time. He was lying in bed, an IV in his arm, monitors showing steady vitals. His eyes were open. He was staring at the ceiling. I stepped inside. "Mr. DeLuca?" His eyes moved to me. They were clear, focused, present. He didn't look confused or sedated. He looked like someone who was resting after a long effort. "You're the new one," he said. His voice was quiet but not weak. "The intake coordinator. Yes, my name is—" "I know who you are. Gerald told me you'd been looking into it." I pulled the visitor's chair closer to the bed and sat down. "You've been in contact with Gerald?" Gerald checks on me sometimes. He's a decent man. "Where have you been? You stopped coming to work last February." DeLuca turned his head on the pillow to look at me more directly. "I was in my apartment. Mostly. For over a year, I needed to listen," he said. "I needed to understand it. The sentence." "Yes. You've been hearing it?" "Since my first year at Langfield, 8 years. At first it was just a curiosity. Then it was an obsession. Then it was—" He paused. Moved his hand vaguely. "Something else. What happened? Why are you here now?" "I collapsed," he said, matter-of-factly. "Malnutrition, dehydration, my neighbor found me. I'd been on the floor for a while, apparently." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I made choices." He looked at me with something that might have been pity. "You're at the pattern stage. You've figured out the date connection, the transmission, the rooms." "Yes." "Have you heard it yet?" "Not just thought it. Heard it." I hesitated. "No." He nodded slowly. "You will. If you haven't already, you're close. The distinction gets thinner." "What do you mean?" "I mean that thinking about the sentence and hearing the sentence are not two different things. They feel different, but they're the same process. The sentence enters through attention. It doesn't matter whether the attention comes from your ears or your mind. Once you've given it enough focus, it's in the room with you. The room? Whatever room you're in, that's what it does. It enters rooms, through people. We carry it in, and then the room has it, and then anyone in the room can catch it. It's not a haunting. It's not a ghost. It's more like humidity, a quality of the air. I felt cold sitting there in the warm hospital room with the beeping monitors and the smell of saline and institutional soap. DeLuca, I said. What does it mean? The body remembers the room. What does that actually mean? He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I wondered if he'd fallen asleep. But his eyes were still open, still focused on some point beyond the ceiling. I don't think it means anything, he finally said. I think meaning is how it disguises itself. You look for meaning and the looking is what feeds it. It's a sentence, 5 words. It enters and it stays and it spreads and that's all it does. It doesn't mean anything. It just is. That doesn't make sense. No, he agreed. It doesn't. I sat with him for another 20 minutes. He didn't say much else. He drifted in and out, not of consciousness, but of engagement. Sometimes he'd look at me like he'd forgotten I was there. Sometimes he'd nod slightly, as if agreeing with something I hadn't said. Before I left, he said one more thing. Stop looking into it. Why? Because looking is listening, and listening is how it gets in. I went back to my office. I sat down. I looked at my filing cabinet full of records, my legal pad at home full of diagrams, my computer with its documents and searches and databases. I should tell you that I stopped, that I took DeLuca's advice, stepped back, let it go, returned to normalcy. That would be the responsible ending to this story, but it wouldn't be true. What I did was go down to the archive that evening after everyone had left. I took the service elevator to the sub-basement and I walked between the rows of metal shelving under the flickering fluorescent lights, and I pulled the oldest file I hadn't yet examined, a box labeled 1973-1974, the first 2 years of the hospital's operation. The box was water damaged. Many of the files inside were stuck together, the ink bled and illegible. But one folder was intact, sealed in a plastic sleeve that someone before DeLuca had placed it in for preservation. It was not a patient file. It was a construction document, a site assessment from 1971, 2 years before the hospital was built. It included a survey of the existing structure on the property, the smaller building, the one that had burned. The document was a report from a demolition company hired to clear the burned remains before construction. Mostly technical, foundation measurements, debris cataloging, environmental hazard assessment. But on the last page, handwritten in pencil, was a note from the site foreman. Basement level contains one intact room, concrete floor and walls, undamaged by fire. Room is empty except for marks on floor, appear to be body outlines, multiple, possibly painted. Source of strong, unpleasant odor, recommend immediate demolition and fill. I looked at the date on the report, September 14th, 1971. I placed the document back in its sleeve. I placed the sleeve back in the box. I put the box back on the shelf. I rode the elevator back up to the 3rd floor. I walked through the locked corridor to my office. I sat down at my desk. The HVAC hummed. The fluorescents buzzed. Somewhere down the hall, a patient was restless. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps pacing, the squeak of hospital socks on linoleum. I sat there and I listened. Not to anything in particular. Not to the hum or the buzz or the footsteps. I was listening to the silence underneath all of those sounds. The silence that filled the space between the walls. The silence that had been here since 1971, since before the hospital was built, since the basement room that survived the fire, the room with the marks on the floor. I was listening because I realized, sitting there in the quiet of the ward at night, that DeLuca was right about one thing. The distinction between thinking and hearing had gotten thinner. I couldn't tell anymore if I was remembering the sentence or if I was receiving it. The 5 words were there in my mind, steady as a pulse, and I could not identify the moment when they had shifted from something I chose to think about to something that was simply present. The body remembers the room. I'm writing this 6 weeks after that night. I'm still working at Langfield. I still process admissions. I still fill out the same forms, ask the same questions, enter the same data. I still drive home to my apartment on Collier Street, still heat up meals, still sleep. When I sleep, in the same bed, in the same room. The sentence is still there. It hasn't gotten louder. It hasn't changed. It's not distressing, exactly. It's just present. Like the sound of your own blood in your ears when you lie in a quiet room. Like the awareness of your own breathing when someone mentions breathing. It's there, and then you notice it, and then you stop noticing it, and then it's still there. I don't know if my apartment is infected now. I don't know if I've carried it in. I don't know if the people I interact with, Sarah in the cafeteria, the barista at the coffee shop on 4th, my landlord who I see in the hallway sometimes, I don't know if they're at risk of hearing it because they've been in a room with me. I don't know if you're at risk. That's not quite true. I think I do know. I think I know, and I'm choosing not to say it directly because saying it directly would make it real in a way that I'm not prepared for. Instead, I'll say this. I noticed last week that I have a new habit. When I enter a room, any room, my office, my apartment, a store, or a restaurant, I pause for just a moment in the doorway. Not long. Maybe half a second, just long enough to listen. I don't know what I'm listening for. I already know what it says. Yesterday was a Thursday, July 14th. I got to work early, not because I was watching the date, not because I was expecting anything, just because I couldn't sleep and the apartment felt too quiet and I wanted to be somewhere with other sounds. At 8:45 a.m., my phone rang. New admit from the ER. Voluntary. A woman, mid-40s, presenting with insomnia, and the ER doc's words, fixation on a phrase she cannot stop hearing. I went down to the intake room. The woman was already sitting there. She looked exhausted. She looked like I feel. I sat down across from her. I opened a fresh form. I clicked my pen. Can you tell me what brings you in today? She looked at me, and then she said something that made the floor feel thin beneath my chair. You hear it too, she said. Don't you? I looked at her. She looked at me. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Somewhere in the walls, the pipes carried water to places I'd never see. Let's start with your name, I said. I finished the intake. I assigned her a room. I went back to my office. I sat down. I closed the door. She knew. She looked at me and she knew. Which means it's visible somehow. It's in me in a way that other people who have it can recognize. We are marked by it. We are rooms now, each of us. Rooms containing a sentence. Rooms that remember what has been placed inside them. I haven't told anyone about this. Not Dr. Harwick, not Sarah, not my mother when she calls on Sundays. I haven't sought treatment. I haven't filed any report, because I don't know what I would say. I don't know how to describe a condition that doesn't appear in any diagnostic manual, that has no name, that has no treatment, that may not technically be an illness at all. The body remembers the room. Maybe DeLuca was right. Maybe it doesn't mean anything. Maybe it's just a sentence that exists in the same way a virus exists, not because it has purpose, but because it replicates. Because replication is its only function. It enters through attention, and it lives in space, and it passes between people, and it never gets louder, and it never goes away. Or maybe it does mean something. Maybe the body is the building. Maybe the room is the one in the basement that survived the fire. Maybe it's remembering us. Maybe it's always been remembering us. I don't know. But I notice now, when I'm quiet, when the building settles at night and the ward goes still, I notice that the sentence doesn't feel like it's in my head anymore. It feels like it's in the walls, in the space between the walls, in the air itself. As if the building is thinking it, and I'm just the one who learned to hear what the building is always saying. I come to work. I process admissions. I fill out forms. I go home. I eat. I sleep sometimes. I listen. Tomorrow is not the 14th. Neither is the day after that. But it will come again. It always comes again. And when it does, someone will sit across from me in that small room with the table bolted to the floor, and they will tell me about a sentence they cannot stop hearing. And I will write it down on the intake form, the same 5 words, and I will send them to their room. And the room will have them, and they will have the room.